Deborah, are you okay? Do you feel bad? Mary, didn't you ask me recently to get your boyfriend a job? Yes, Paul is a very good driver. You won't regret it. Right, but he was fired from the cab company for a reason. Deborah looked at Mary questioningly, and she lowered her eyes in a blush. Okay, let him come in tomorrow. I'll talk to him, and maybe we'll take him. But on probation, Mr. Mary rejoiced and began to thank Deborah, but she had already stared into some papers and made it clear that the conversation was over. The next day, Paul, immaculately shaven, wearing pants and shirt perfectly ironed by Mary, stood at the entrance of the hotel. This was the chance he could not miss. Now the main thing was to make Deborah like him and pass the probationary period. The interview was quick and Paul got the job. Given how successfully her fiancé was working, Mary discovered only a couple of months later when she got to the maternity hospital. She repeatedly tried to call Paul to tell him about his daughter's birth, but the phone was silent. From her shift worker who came to see her, Mary heard that the day before, Paul had driven away Deborah with a suitcase, and no one else had seen them. Mary did not know what to think. She cried all day long, calling hospitals and morgues, but all to no avail. Mary was waiting to be discharged so she could write to the police about her fiancé's disappearance. But when she came home with the child, she saw a miserable scrap of paper on the bed in their rented apartment. It was a note from Paul. Though placing her newborn daughter on the bed, Mary started reading. Paul briefly informed her that he was leaving her for Deborah and that they were going on vacation together. At the end of it was a postscript. The apartment is paid for to the end of the month. Then pay yourself, or you can go to your aunt's in the village, since your boss doesn't want to see you working in a hotel anymore. And as we are not married, I do not owe you anything. Miss Mary threw herself on the bed and wept in pain, resentment, and disappointment. She realized that the fate of many young girls who got pregnant before marriage, who believed their boyfriend's stories, had caught up with her. First, they had no time to get married. Then, they had no money. Then, Paul had problems with his job. At Tara now, she had to go back to the village alone with the baby to her aunt and listen to her reproaches and lectures. But she had to go back since there was no other way out. At the threshold of her aunt's house, Mary stopped in indecision. Aunt Helen was a strict and unkind woman, and Mary was afraid of her reaction. But suddenly the door swung open. "Welcome in. Don't be afraid," said Helen, quite friendly and smiling, took the baby out of Mary's hands. "How did you name your daughter?" "Victoria," Mary whispered. "Victoria means winning. It's a great name, not like yours. I never could understand why your mother named you that." Mary sighed, listening to the familiar grumbling of her aunt. She was the older sister of Mary's deceased father, and she would have been grandmother to her niece by age. Helen, noticing the gloomy expression on the girl's face, stumped. "Okay, darling, I am not going to ask questions now, so don't worry. You need to take care of the baby, and first of all, to feed her." Mary cried and told her aunt that she could not feed her daughter because she had lost her milk. Helen gasped and realized that her niece had a serious problem in the city. But when the baby girl was bathed, changed her clothes, and fed with formula, she fell asleep and Helen thought about what they should do next. The woman said that an old rich woman lived in their village. The locals did not like her, and she, due to her contentious character, did not let anyone near her and seldom communicated with anyone except Helen. Fixed in recent years, Mrs. Carter became quite sick and could not go to the store or cook her own food, so Helen helped her as much as she could. But now the situation had changed. It had become difficult for Helen to help Mrs. Carter because of her age. So she suggested that Mary get a job at Mrs. Carter's house as a helper. Mary was in dire need of money and work, but she still had doubts since she had a little baby in her arms. "Don't worry, I'll take care of Victoria," assured Mary's aunt. "This is your own home, and you and I are the family." There was so much tenderness and warmth in her voice that Mary simply could not believe her ears. And for the first time in her life, Helen told her niece about her hard fate, about her 3 miscarriages in her youth, about how her husband had left her for someone else, and how she had suffered. And Mary finally understood much of what was incomprehensible to her and her aunt's behavior when she was a teenager. "And don't be afraid of Mrs. Carter.
She only looks so formidable," said Helen. And in great secret, she told her niece the Mrs. Carter's sad story. It was all about her daughter, Caroline. The girl had been in love with a poor guy, Tom, since high school, and Mrs. Carter was against it and forbade them to date. When the guy was drafted into the army, Mrs. Carter arranged with the local mailman and intercepted the lovers' letters to each other. Tom, thinking that Caroline had forgotten about him, stopped writing to her and returned from the army already with his bride. Mrs. Carter was pleased. Her plan had succeeded, and on the day of Tom's wedding, Mrs. Carter went to a neighboring town to visit relatives, and her daughter, left home alone, took sleeping pills. But when Mrs. Carter returned home the next morning, the girl was already dead. Since then, Mrs. Carter lives alone in her enormous home with her wealth. But does she need it, since she destroyed her own daughter with her own hands?
Mary listened to the story and promised her aunt that she would try to be patient with Mrs. Carter and not let her down. Until this moment, Mary thought that she was alone in this world, and it turned out that she had the best aunt. Everything was going great now. She would have a job, and her daughter would have a wonderful nanny ready to give her all her unspent love.
The next day, Helen went to see Mrs. Carter. They talked for a long time, and at first the woman grumbled and didn't even want to hear anything. But then, with difficulty, she agreed. At heart, Mrs. Carter knew that except Helen, she has no one to rely on, so she grumbled more out of habit. The first time, it was not easy for Mary with grumpy Mrs. Carter. The young woman often got home late at night and fell on her bed without energy. And it was not easy for Helen at first to cope with little Victoria. But as time went on, things gradually got better. The only room to which Mary was forbidden to enter was on the 2nd floor, and only Mrs. Carter had the key. She did not explain the reason, and Mary tried to pretend that she was not interested. But the reason was simple. Carolyn had died in this room. She had died of unhappy love and her mother's cruelty. Then on that fateful day, Mrs. Carter had locked the girl in her room, fearing that she would go to her ex-fiancé's wedding and do something stupid. Could she have thought then that her daughter had already made up her mind, and that sleeping pills had already been prepared in her bedside table? And to forget herself and fall asleep forever, but there was nothing Mrs. Carter could change now. Watching Mary, she often bitterly thought that if she had not been so cruel to her daughter, then today it would be her granddaughter helping her, not Mary. The years had passed. Little Victoria was growing up, and Mary was still caring for the elderly woman. But now she did so more out of the call of her heart than out of duty, because they had become very attached to each other. Mrs. Carter began to sicken more and more often. At lecturing in the evenings, she usually sat near the fireplace, which was burning in any weather, both in winter and in summer. But one day, she called Mary to help her up to the second floor. As it was the first time in all the years that Mary had been working there, so the girl was very surprised at such a request and readily helped Mrs. Carter. The elderly woman moved slowly, resting on each step. Finally, when she reached the locked door, she leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, and stood like that for a while, swallowing her tears. It's then she held out the key to Mary. "Open it and don't ask me anything," she said. Mary nodded and opened the door. Mrs. Carter gestured for her to stay outside and disappeared into the darkness of the room. The girl stood for a long time, listening to the sounds. Disconcerted, she did call out to the elderly woman, but there was no answer. Miss Mary thought that Mrs. Carter had fallen asleep and opened the door going into the room. The elderly woman was really asleep in an armchair by the window, clutching her daughter's toy, a fluffy rabbit. On her lap, there was a box with Caroline's belongings. Mary looked closely at the woman again and suddenly felt that for a sleeping person, she clutched the toy too tightly. And to her horror, she realized that Mrs. Carter was dead. After the funeral, Helen and Mary were surprised to find out that the woman had made a will a year ago for the only close people to her, her helpers. It was an unexpected gift for Mary and Helen, until apparently it was Mrs. Carter's way of thanking them for their care and kindness. Literally as another 5 years passed. One day, the hotel receptionist knocked on the door of the hostess' office. "Mary, excuse me, there's a new driver here. Are you interviewing him yourself, or should I take care of this?" "Invite him in. I'll talk to him myself." After a couple of minutes, a man entered the office. Mary looked up and saw Paul in front of her, but he did not immediately recognize his former girlfriend in such an elegant, beautiful woman. He remembered her as a frightened, anxious girl with a huge belly, which he had accompanied to the maternity hospital. Then, breathing a sigh of relief, he went straight to Deborah, with whom he could finally spend a whole night, and he did not think at all about how his fiancée would be giving birth to their daughter. It's in pain and crying. crying with resentment into the pillow when the other women in the hospital were visited by their husbands. The only problem was that the fairy tale ended quickly for him. Deborah got fed up with him after 6 months, and she quickly found a replacement. And now, this bald, unemployed loser with no wife and children stood before Mary and could not believe his eyes. He shifted his gaze to the desk and saw a nice framed picture. There was a handsome man hugging Mary in a white wedding dress, and a beautiful blonde girl of about 7 stood beside her. "Mary, darling, is that really you?" "I am not your darling, and I don't have a job for you," said Mary coldly. "Natalia, call security. Tell them to escort this man outside." Mary stood at the window and smiled as she watched a stunned Paul leaving the hotel. She was mentally thanking him for leaving her then, because his betrayal had turned out in such a happy end for her. Narrated by Deirdre, a